Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We'll get started in about 60 seconds. Give folks a few more minutes to pop in. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to today's nonprofit lobbying workshop and legislative update. I'm Pam Clark Reidenbach. I'm the CEO of NICNE, the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence, where we focus on capacity building, promoting, modeling, and growing innovation, excellence, and social impact. Before introducing our speakers, I want to encourage you to complete the post-program evaluation. The link for that evaluation will be at the chat, and Billy will pop that in toward the end of the presentation. Also know that we are recording the session for today, so we can share it with those unable to attend, but we will not record the Q&A. So without further ado, it is truly my pleasure to introduce our speakers and new friends from Forefront. Holly Ambuehl achieved a master's degree in social work from Boston College with a concentration in community organizing, policy, planning, and administration. Currently, Holly directs federal and state policy and advocacy as the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Forefront, which is a statewide membership association for both nonprofits and foundations in Illinois. And also, Alec Lopata. Alec works on the Forefront policy team as policy coordinator. Previously, he was with Freedom Consulting, where he worked with philanthropic clients to advise on the policy landscape around their work and develop public-private partnerships. He was also a Dunn Fellow in Governor Pritzker's office, working on budget and economic policy. Please join me in welcoming Holly and Alec.
Thank you, Pam. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. What would anyone rather do than end their week with a presentation on lobbying rules, right? This is going to be fun. So we're so happy to be here. We appreciate having the chance to partner with NICNE and the good work they do. And before we jump into the lobbying rules, we'll do a little overview of Forefront for those that are newer to what Forefront is and the role we play in our state. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Alec for that. The QR code you see, if you scan that this morning, will take you to our Policy Action Center, and we'll provide that again at the end and explain how to use that in tandem with our legislative update at the end of the presentation. We will do some Q&A. We'll turn the recording off for that. Just by way of explanation, the reason we do that is so folks feel comfortable asking any question and not worrying about that question living online or the answer living online, so that we can speak freely about concerns or questions you have on this topic, which I know can be a little challenging. So just a heads up about that. Don't feel the need to take frantic notes. We'll be happy to offer these slides as follow-up to this meeting. So just try to soak it up and ask questions via chat or as we go. We want this to be interactive and conversational, and make sure we address your questions as we go through, and then any at the end that you'd like to ask privately. So I'll hand it over to Alec. He's going to go over Forefront, and then I'll pick it back up in a couple minutes.
Awesome. Thanks, Holly. So before we get into the lobbying rules, as Holly said, we just wanted to introduce Forefront for those of you who aren't aware of who we are and what we do, so that you have context of sort of why we're here and why we're sort of becoming experts on these lobbying rules. So Forefront, we're the statewide membership alliance for the entire social impact sector. So that's all nonprofits, all foundations, all grant makers, all philanthropic advisors as well. And so we do a lot of different things to represent the sector. I'll talk about some of the things that we do to support. It's important to note we, in our most recent strategic plan to advance that mission that we have of building a vibrant social impact sector in Illinois, we've made two key fundamental commitments to center in our work, which is first that we're really focusing on our statewide presence. We, in a previous iteration of our organization many years ago, were only focused in Chicago, but we really want to emphasize that statewide presence we've now had for many years. And then we've put racial equity at the center of all of our work as well. It's not a separate program. It's not something just to one side, but it's core in driving everything that we do. So that's just important to know about how we do that work to build a vibrant social impact sector. In terms of what we do to serve all of these many members, we have lots of different benefits and services that we provide outside of just the policy work that Holly and I do. I sort of run through this really quickly. We do things like peer skill shares, where you can connect with other experts in our sector who know exactly what the answer to a question you might have is and can help you work through it. We have a library that helps do donor research or anything to help you find grants and information to help your fundraising. We have a job board. We do training work, including a grant makers and a nonprofit institute, and then many other things that our colleague Doris can talk through more if you're interested in learning what a membership at Forefront looks like. In terms of the policy team, I could run through this quick because Pam gave a great introduction already, but Holly and I are the team. It's the two of us. We're both registered lobbyists, and we bring this great experience in a wide variety of different roles into this work, and now supporting this large sector, this 11% of the economy that is the social impact sector. And so we do that at 3 different levels. We're doing federal work. We do that with the National Council of Nonprofits, the United Philanthropy Forum, Council on Foundations, the Independent Sector. They're key federal organizations that represent nonprofit associations and philanthropic supporting philanthropy serving organizations. And so we work closely with all of them at the federal level on our advocacy. You can see we're able to get a lot of really great discussions as a result of these partnerships. This is us with Tammy Duckworth last year, which is awesome. We do a lot of work as well at the state level. We're going to talk about a lot of that here today, but that we seek to find issues that really impact the entire sector. There's lots of different parts of the sector, from environmental organizations to health and human service to museums and everything in between, and many others. And we want to support organizations that represent those parts of the sector, but then find issues that are overarching across all of that and really cover the whole gamut of the issues that the social impact sector faces. And then finally, we do a little bit of local stuff. That's mostly in Chicago, focused on these lobbying rules that are specific to Chicago, and Holly will talk a little bit about those today, as well as a couple other issues that might pop up in the short term. But our focus really is state and federal, and so that's really the nuts and bolts of what we do. I think it's important. In the past, there have been questions about how Forefront makes decisions about what we're going to support and how we set our platform. And so we sort of just wanted to run through how we do that really quickly, just to explain how we've arrived where we are. And it goes on this long circular process, everything from talking with our counterparts in other states through those networks that I mentioned, to meeting with stakeholders like you all, like members of our policy committee, like other sector leaders that we regularly talk to, and getting their buy-in to ideas that might come up. We have our board review everything that we do, and then every year we will end up with a new legislative agenda. And we'll talk through what this year's legislative agenda looks like. So our goal here, though, is to take that new direction that sorry, I missed what I was saying. There's this new overarching set of platform statements that we have, which we just set this year, is going to bring this goal to support people that lead, govern their nonprofits, lead foundations, and support them to do their work. It's based on this, when I mentioned at the top, the overarching goal of the organization from our new strategic plan to improve racial equity and justice, well-being, and economic security in Illinois. And so that has come down into the policy statements for our platform that Holly will talk through later in the presentation. But that's sort of the big goals that we're setting as an organization and as a policy team in this new year. I'll pass it over to Holly now, and we can talk through the lobbying basics and then the legislative update.
Thanks, Alec. Does anybody have questions about Forefront before we move on? Okay, seeing none, feel free to chime in if you think of something later. So one of the issues that fits in the description Alec described as far as something that affects everybody is this lobbying issue. So that's why Forefront's pick this up as a key priority, and something that we know, it doesn't matter what kind of work you do, there's a chance that you're at some point going to intersect with your local officials or your state officials or your federal officials. And we encourage that kind of relationship because it's so important from our perspective for them to hear your voices, because you understand your communities and what people are dealing with in your community so well. So we're going to start by teeing this up a little bit from a high level, just a review of the difference between advocacy and lobbying and the federal rules that kind of underpin the whole system, and then go into the state specific rules. And then I'll also briefly touch on the Chicago rules, which are different and in addition to the state and federal. So if you're actually from Chicago, if you would indicate that in chat, I just want to get a feel for how many folks operate inside the city of Chicago that might be here today, because if no one's here, then we can skip that part. So if you would identify yourself, we got at least one I see popping up. Thank you. And if anybody else wants to share where you're from, we welcome you to do that too. We have a big state with, hopefully a lot of folks from all over the state here today, but the rules in Chicago are different uniquely. And so that's why it's important to specifically cover Chicago. So first, advocacy versus lobbying. So use your thumbs up or your thumbs down. And I want to just do a quick poll. True or false? Nonprofits are allowed to lobby. Thumbs up if it's true, thumbs down if it's false. I see some thumbs ups. Good. No a couple thumbs downs. All right. Thanks for participating in that very rudimentary poll. So the answer is true. Nonprofits are allowed to do some lobbying, but there's boundaries and parameters around that, and we're going to speak to that during this presentation. So if you weren't sure about that, that's the purpose of this presentation. We're going to, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to understand what that means for a nonprofit organization in our state. So advocacy is different than lobbying. Advocacy is something that we should all be doing all the time, and we probably are. That might entail, writing a fact sheet or a research report that's intended to inform decision makers with data about your work or about your community. But it becomes lobbying the minute you hand that fact sheet to a legislator or elected official and ask them to take a specific action as a result of that information. So if you write a fact sheet about a bill, or Forefront writes a fact sheet about a bill and gives it to this group, we're educating the sector, and that's not lobbying. But if we hand that fact sheet about a bill to a legislator and say, we want you to vote yes on this bill, and here's information about the bill, that's lobbying. So there's a boundary there that's important. And we're going to explain that in more detail as we move through this. So lobbying requires direct contact with a covered official, elected officials, and who's included in that list of covered officials varies depending on what level of government we're talking about. And there's some pretty strict rules at the state level in Illinois, which is kind of unique compared to some other states. So we're going to go into that in a little bit. It also requires you to be talking about a specific piece of legislation and asking them to take a specific action. So that's how the federal government kind of defines the parameters around lobbying. So if you run into Dick Durbin at a breakfast and talk about the weather, that's not lobbying. Or if you run into your state legislator at a school event and are talking about your kids, that's not lobbying. It's when you're going the extra step to ask them to take action in their role as a covered official about a specific piece of legislation that you need to be mindful of the rules. So moving on to the next slide, the other piece to be mindful of, especially in an election year, we're approaching a season of local elections, right? So lots of mayors and local elections happening this spring. And then every other year we have major federal elections. It's important to be mindful of the boundaries around a school board. It's important to be mindful around the difference between lobbying and electioneering. So nonprofits are allowed to do some lobbying according to federal rules, but we're never allowed to engage in electioneering or partisanship. There's a hard no on that. And there's a difference. So that's what I wanted to just lay out here. So 501c3s are never allowed to endorse a candidate or a party. And appearing to do those can also get you in trouble. So that's why the election season is important, because your behavior might change as you approach an election and enter the time. For example, now in Chicago with early voting opening, we're in an active election season. And so you have to be mindful of how any activities might appear to be endorsing a candidate that's running for election at the Chicago municipal elections in a way that may not apply in the summer when there's no election coming down the pike. So it's just important to be aware of those contextual pieces, and remember that you can never take a position on a candidate or a party, but you can operate in terms of having a position on a ballot initiative. So that's difference, which I think is on the next slide. So Alec, go ahead. So this goes into more detail on the previous slide, the things that you're permitted to do versus things you're never permitted to do that would fall into that electioneering camp. So openly endorsing a candidate in your position as a nonprofit obviously is a no-no. And then making campaign contributions. So your nonprofit itself cannot use your nonprofit money to contribute to a campaign. Employees are allowed to do that on their own time with their own money, but they can never be reimbursed for doing that by their nonprofit employer, or that would be a violation of the rules. You also cannot ask a campaign candidate to sign a pledge, and so on. So it's just important to understand the boundaries there. Any question on the difference between advocacy, lobbying, or electioneering?
Holly, there was one question in chat about how to approach nonpartisan elections. So if there's not a party attached to candidates on the ballot, are nonprofits allowed to engage in those kind of elections?
No, because it's still influencing the outcome of an election. So that's a good question. Let me see if I can find a reference to that, just to be able to find a reference to that. So we'll follow up with that in our follow-up. Any other questions?
Hi, yes. We were kind of hoping to profile an alumni of one of our programs, but they're currently running for our local office in Chicago. And we were told that we could not do that until after the election. Just want to see if that's the case. We didn't want to mention what party or what race, and kind of really focus more on just the person and their journey. But would you suggest kind of waiting till after the election, or how could we navigate that?
Yes, I would wait. That's a great example, and it's a good illustration of the caution I would take. I mean, if you did that, no one's probably going to knock on your door, right? But because it's hard for our government to enforce these laws because there's so many players, but it puts you at risk for somebody potentially filing a complaint in a way that you wouldn't necessarily want to deal with. It would be disruptive to your work. So if with stuff like that, if there's any opportunity to wait, I would just wait. Good question. I saw the question about 501c4s. So 501c4s are still nonprofits. So that's a helpful question because it reminds me I forgot to explain this piece of it. So the federal government's interest in these boundaries is because nonprofit organizations, which include C3s, C4s, C5s, which aren't many, C6s, don't pay taxes. And so the expectation is that by having the benefit of not paying taxes, there's a community interest that you have to return to our society. And that's the reason you get to skip paying taxes, right? Is because you're doing good in your community. And one of the expectations around that is that you're not influencing the outcome of partisan elections and elections. And so even though C4s, I'm going to come back to the C4s can do more unlimited lobbying than a C3 can in terms of the federal government's expectation, they're still not allowed to engage in partisan activity. Does that help? Any other questions on that? Alec, you can go on to the next slide. Feel free to pop back up with questions and chatter verbally. So I touched on this, no campaign contributions. But I do want to note employees can do that on their own time. That's free speech in our country. So there's no expectation that like no one can donate to their preferred party or candidate on your own time. It's just can't have anything to do with your work or your budget at work. One thing I'll note here is that the different systems in our state have different reporting requirements on campaign contributions. So in Chicago, if you are a registered lobbyist, even if you do that on your own time, you're going to have to report it on your personal registration filings. So it's important to know that if you intend to register in Chicago uniquely, you're going to have to report campaign contributions you make on your own time, even if they're not made on behalf of your nonprofit. So that's just important to know. If that's something you wouldn't want out there in a public document, then you might want to abstain from doing that. At the state level, campaign contributions are not reportable. So there's some different rules there. And we're going to come back to that later. So the federal government approaches these rules. Their interest is in how much lobbying you can do. So the federal government kind of has like standards or thresholds that they're mindful of for C3s. And once you exceed those thresholds, things change. But if you stay under those thresholds, then you're okay. And you don't have to do much. You can kind of operate freely. You don't have to do a lot of reporting. And that's true for all public charities. So any C3 can kind of engage with elected officials at any level of government, as long as you don't exceed a certain percentage of your time or money directly related to activities that would be defined as lobbying by the federal government. And remember, the federal government has a very narrow definition of lobbying. So that it means you're in direct contact with an elected official, asking them to take a specific action on a specific piece of legislation. So in most cases, most nonprofits wouldn't come anywhere near exceeding a federal threshold that would require them to do more lobbying reporting. So that's important to know. At the federal level, there's kind of some leeway without having to do more than just report the fact that you do some lobbying on your 990 or on a particular form that I'll reference on a later slide. The difference between a C3 and a C4 is that C4s are really intended to do advocacy. That's kind of the nature of their tax status. And so C4s can do as much lobbying as they want according to the federal rules and not have to worry too much about watching a threshold in terms of their time and expenses. Alec, you can go ahead. Thank you. So at the federal level, there's no registration system where you have to like register as a lobbyist, so to speak. It's different. It just shows up on your tax filings, as I mentioned. And the federal government looks at the lobbying you do at all levels of government. So, and wants you to aggregate the time and money you spend on direct lobbying for their threshold. And direct lobbying, as I said, is defined very narrowly by the federal government. And so most nonprofits don't have to worry too much about that. And it also, they don't include the executive branch. So if you work with one of the federal agencies through your grants or contracts, that would not be construed as lobbying, even if you're trying to influence those grants through the state agency officials. by the federal government. That's different at the state though. So we'll come back to that piece. So even though you may not have to do a registration at the federal level, if you do engage in anything that the federal government defines as lobbying, you do want to be very careful that you have good time tracking and expense tracking systems in place, because you're going to want to be able to demonstrate that you haven't spent most of your time or money on lobbying when you do your tax filings. Alec, you can go to the next slide. So again, just to summarize the difference, C3 shouldn't lobby too much. C4s can do as much as they want. And the federal government for C3s has what's called an insubstantial part test, or the 501H election, and expenditures reported in the 990. So for example, when you hire a person like me that is fully focused on public policy and advocacy work, that's the kind of carve out you would make on your expenditures. Or if you fly to DC to meet with your senator, that kind of stuff, you'd want to kind of track the things that are specifically dedicated to what the federal government defines as lobbying. And I know some of you, if you have questions about the logistics on this, Boulder Advocacy, 2 words, Boulder Advocacy, is the best organization to go to. They're by far the biggest experts on this for our nonprofit world. They have lots of resources and explanations. The National Council of Nonprofits also has some good tools to help you understand how to use the 501H election and so on. So I would encourage you, if you're trying to figure that piece out, to look for those resources, and we can also help provide them in the follow-up to this webinar. Go ahead. So moving now to the state level. So let me pause. Any questions about the federal rules before we go on to the state? Okay, state rules. So we have to, as nonprofits, comply with federal and state rules. So whatever state or states we operate in. And in contrast to the federal government, which just really is worried about how much lobbying you do, the state doesn't care how much you do. If you do any, you have to abide by their rules. And they want to have transparency and accountability around the influence that's happening outside of the public eye. So that's really their goal. The state's looking to put sunshine on lobbying activities that influence outcomes. And so they're less interested in whether or not you spend most of your time or money on it, and just whether you do it at all. So they don't have a threshold in our state in place to say, if you spend less than X% of your time or money on lobbying, you're exempt from these requirements. There's no such threshold in Illinois. So it's either a yes or no situation. You either do or don't lobby. And so therefore you either do or don't have to register as a lobbyist and comply with related reporting requirements. So the state is regulating who has to register and what you have to report after you register. And all of those reports are publicly available and searchable in the Secretary of State's database. So if you're curious if somebody's registered as a lobbyist, you can go to the Secretary of State website and search an organization's name and find out if they're registered and then who their dedicated lobbyist is. Conversely, if you're curious if a contract lobbyist represents who they represent and what clients they have, you can look up the contract lobbyist and all of their clients will be listed and so on. And then all of the expense reports are public as well. So that's another thing that's important to be mindful of if you go in the direction of lobbying, is that all of that information will be available to the general public. Go ahead, Alec. So these are the key questions for deciding if you're required to register in the state of Illinois. You have to think about the activities that you're doing and who or at whom those activities are directed, and whether that's happening directly or indirectly. So in a so-called grassroots way, where you're engaging through the call to action that's made by somebody else that might be a registered lobbyist. And that happens a lot with C4 and C3 organizations, where they issue a call to action to their members or their stakeholders. And then you engage with your legislators through that call to action. So that would be considered grassroots lobbying or grassroots expenditures, which are treated differently. So we'll come back to that. And then there are some exceptions, and it's important to be mindful of those exceptions. And if you're not sure if you're exempted or accepted for a specific activity or expenditure, that you seek some guidance from the Secretary of State or somebody that knows more, just to make sure you have the right information. So the state's law is very sweeping in contrast to the way the federal government defines lobbying, which is extremely targeted. The state defines lobbying as activities that are seeking to influence outcomes and cultivate goodwill, which can be confusing. So that's part of why we're here today, because it is confusing. And there are some gray areas. So we're going to talk about that. And at the state level, the key test really for activities that are defined as lobbying, which includes trying to influence outcomes or cultivate goodwill, would be whether or not you're compensated while you're doing so. So the compensation is a very key test in our state. So if, for example, I'm compensated, I am employed by Forefront, part of my job is lobbying and advocacy. And so anything I do in this role as a compensated staff member that meets the state's definition of lobbying would require me to report or to register and submit reporting requirements. And so the easiest way to circumvent registration is to assign all lobbying activities to volunteers. So if you have any concerns, that's the cleanest way to do it. Because whenever a paid staff person starts operating in this space, that's when you're going to have to register. So that would include boards of directors, your volunteer stakeholders, your constituents that benefit from your services but aren't paid for talking to legislators, that kind of thing. So in a conversation with the state legislator, for example, if as an executive director brings a board member, when you get to the point where you're asking the legislator to take a vote a certain way, that if the board member has that conversation, that person as an uncompensated volunteer board member would not have to register as a lobbyist. But in that same conversation, if the executive director had that piece of the talking points, in theory, based on the letter of the law, that executive director would have to register as a lobbyist. The thing I'll note, and this is important, in addition to the test around compensation, open meetings are never subject to this requirement. So what that means is anything that's subject to the open meetings law. So that includes town council meetings, township meetings, county board meetings, state hearings at the legislature, other meetings where there's public access to the meeting. And so it's part of the public record. And it's not happening behind the scenes. Those things do not require you to register. So if you testify at a hearing or provide a witness slip on a bill, you don't have to register specifically for those kinds of activities because they occur in a space where there is sunshine and in the public eye, and it's part of the public record. So that's really important as well, in addition to the compensation test. Any questions on those two pieces? The thing I'll add on compensation is that it doesn't matter how much compensation you get. So if it's only a little bit of your job, there's no specific exemption for that in state law, which is one of the things that we would recommend they reconsider. So we'll come back to that. I see a question. Let me just pause. So thank you. Excellent. Yeah, I think so. That's on my slide here, but I didn't explain it. The volunteer. So if a volunteer is compensated more than $500, yes, then you have to report that and register. So an example would be if you pay for someone's time to appear at a lobby day because otherwise they won't attend, or you're covering their time, or you're flying them to DC or flying them to, not DC, flying them from like Springfield or from Chicago to Springfield to meet with legislators, and you pay for their hotel and their flight or their train, and that exceeds $500, that's when you would have to register. So In addition to avoiding compensation, if you don't want to register, you want to think about the expenses related to the activities and try to minimize those as well. Because anything you spend on, like if you take a legislator out to dinner and a board member, like your board goes out to dinner with legislators and it costs more than $500, that would exceed that threshold and so on. So when you have specific questions about specific situations, you can always ask us or email the Secretary of State, just to be mindful of those boundaries. There's all kinds of situations and nuance that can come up, and that's why this issue is so difficult. So it's good to kind of cover yourself and ask questions in advance of meetings that will occur. If you're responding to something online, is that considered in the public eye? Only if it's an online space that is subject to the open meetings law. So that would include a virtual hearing at the state legislature, which still happens, where folks testify virtually. But if it's just a meeting like this, and if a legislator was here today, and even though this is kind of a public event, if we were talking to them about how to vote on a bill, that would be construed as lobbying. There's no inherent protection just in doing something in a public space. It has to be an actual official public meeting subject to the Open Meetings Act. If you want to ask a follow-up, Terry, I'm not sure exactly what kind of situation you're thinking of, so I can address a follow-up if that is needed. Okay, Alec, you can go ahead. So this is how the state defines lobbying. As you can see, it's a very long definition in contrast to the federal government's. The bold text here are the pieces of the definition that were added at the beginning of last year. So at the beginning of last year, January 1, 2022, the state's new law around ethics reform and Lobbyist Registration Act rules became effective. And so the definition of lobbying changed at that time. And that's when they added the pieces referencing municipal, county, or township governments, and exempted the making of grants, and so on. So those bold pieces are new. The soliciting of others to communicate is referencing grassroots activity, where an organization like Forefront makes a grassroots call to action. So to all of our, via email, hey, there's this bill coming up, contact your legislators to support this in the committee hearing or what have you. That kind of activity where we're asking our stakeholders to communicate directly to legislators would be included in the definition of lobbying. And so Forefront would be out of compliance if we weren't registered, if we make that kind of call to action to our stakeholders, asking them to communicate and influence legislators on a piece of legislation. The participants in that call to action, though, would be exempted from registration because they're responding to our call to action and we're registered and in compliance. So specifically, when you're responding to a call to action, there's an exemption for folks doing that, or for folks attending an event, a grassroots event. So that would include a lobby day at the legislature. Forefront says we're going to have a nonprofit lobby day, everybody come. As long as we're registered and we're reporting the expenses related to that event, that would include the transportation costs of bringing our stakeholders to the Capitol, any meals we provide and that kind of thing. The folks that participate in those grassroots events do not have to register just in order to participate in that event. So I'm looking quickly at the questions. If you say something like, consider making a comment about blank, does that count in grassroots lobbying? I'm not sure I understand that question. If you want to speak up and explain. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was referencing including the soliciting of others to communicate, because you're soliciting when you send out a grassroots call to your volunteers, you're assigning a lobbying task to your volunteers, and then you say something like, I've seen a lot of communications that are consider making a comment about X to X. Is that does that count as lobbying in these changes to the rules? Because does that is that considered soliciting of others to communicate, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, if you're commenting on a specific bill or proposal that's moving before a legislator and asking folks to comment on it, I think these are the kind of the gray areas where it's difficult, but I think the sponsors of this underlying legislation would probably say yes, like the person making that request from their constituents is trying to influence the outcome of legislation, and that's the kind of activity they want to capture with lobbying rules. So it depends on like the messaging, who you're reaching out to, if it's simply to educate them about an issue, but if it's related to a bill that's moving, those kinds of things. So when you have a question about a specific activity you might engage in, we can talk anytime to you all about that. So but I would also encourage you to email the Secretary of State's office, and we'll provide that email at the end of the deck. And that way you have some advice from them and you kind of cover yourself and know what you're doing in advance. So hopefully that's helpful for now. I know that without like a lot of details, it's hard to be very specific in my advice. So let's talk offline if you need a follow-up on that. Asking for administrative changes that don't require legislation is now lobbying. Yes, unfortunately. It's fun in these presentations, I always hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's why we're making these presentations, is because we want folks to understand what's changed and the sweeping nature of these rules in our state, and how important it is to be mindful of them so that you can make educated decisions about your lobbyist registration status. So when you're trying to influence the rules process, for example, when a bill passes and an agency is promulgating rules to roll out a new program or a grant program, if you're making a public comment on that through the public comment system, you do not have to register for submitting public comments, because that would be similar to participating in an open meeting where it's part of the public process. And so that's different. It's the behind the scenes stuff, like where if you were to meet with Secretary Grace Ho or the Deputy Governor for Human Services, and you're talking to her about how they should run a program, that's different because it's out of the public eye and you're trying to influence outcome and policy at the administrative level. So hopefully that's helpful, but because there is a difference between engaging in a public rules process and other things that happen behind the public eye. If you have a legislator who is sponsoring a bill that benefits those you serve and you are assisting by advising them. So good question. I think it depends. One thing I try to advise people is think about who's initiated that conversation, because there are exemptions for providing expertise and education. So if a legislator is approaching you and saying, hey, how does this affect you? What do you think about this? That's different than you proactively going to a legislator and telling them what to do with a bill. And so you think about the direction of that communication and how it's flowing and who's requesting it, and that might help you navigate that. If a paid lobbyist is leading this, is that okay? Yeah, so if you have a lobbyist or are relying on the lobbyist that represents your trade organization and things like that, and you're in a room with them, that's fine. You have some cover by being in the room with them. Just have them address the how to vote piece and position yourself as the subject matter expert. That's definitely a good way to approach that. And Jackie, I see you posted something, but I can't read it. I'm sorry, it's too small on my screen. So if that's important, I'll ask Alec or somebody else to retype it or prompt me verbally.
I think it duplicated my original question. I don't know why it
Okay.
did that. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Okay. So I got you.
Yes,
Any more?
thank you.
Okay. 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 So for the sake of time, I'm going to keep going with the presentation, and we'll pick up some more questions further along, just to make sure we get to the content before we run out of time today. Alec, I'm sorry, will you go back quickly? I just want to make sure. Okay, good. Okay, go ahead. Covered officials. So this is the other thing. So again, the bold text is the new law. So in addition to the expanded definition of lobbying, we also have a longer list of officials that are considered covered, which means lobbying them now requires you to register at the state. So this is key, especially for folks kind of in smaller communities that might interface a lot with their mayor or city council or county board, or have partnerships with their local government entities for after school programs or facility use or what have you. And I know a lot of nonprofit officials serve on boards and commissions or may have local elected officials on their boards of directors. So these are very important changes for our sector. And this is a big part of why we've been concerned about this new law and why we're working so hard on it, because the inclusion of local officials has very sweeping implications for nonprofits that are kind of unique to other parts of our communities where it may not affect the private sector as much as it affects us. So we are trying to make sure our legislators understand that. And where you have situations now that this introduces confusion, I would encourage you to submit those questions to the Secretary of State, because the more questions they get about this, the more it will help them think through the nuances here when they promulgate rules. So some member organizations have elected officials on their boards. Is it now an issue? I think it's kind of like everything else. It depends. I think it could be. Depends on how you conduct your board meetings and what their role is. If you're an organization that has an elected official at any level of government, and that elected official comes from the same level of government or government body from which you get a lot of funding or grants, then that would be like a gray area that you would want to be really mindful of, because it could be construed as trying to influence appropriation decisions, or the way they're managing grants and programs. But if that's not the case and you don't have any type of financial relationship with the body that they serve on, there's probably a little bit more safety. So it just kind of depends on the role they play on your board and why they're on your board, what your intent is. And I think it's good to be mindful of that. And if you have a specific scenario you're concerned about, I would seek some advice from the Secretary of State. But I do think it's important to have that conversation and be mindful of it, rather than just continuing to operate that way. I would hit the pause button and think about the potential consequences in light of this new law. Any questions? This will include state advisory councils established by law. I'm not sure, Gerald, let's talk about that more specifically in a moment. If you would hold that question, I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're talking about there. Alec, you can go ahead. So based on these definitions and boundaries, the state requires you to register before any lobbying occurs every year. So that has to occur early in January every year. There's no grace period. And there's also some related ethical and sexual harassment trainings that you do online. There's no grace period, but they're pretty simple. It's a matter of like reading and certifying. And then after you register, you have to submit online expenditure reports every week, every 2 weeks, year round, plus a mid-year attestation that your prior reporting is accurate. Salary is not a reportable expenditure. It's only the money you spend on direct lobbying. So like when you take a legislator to dinner or you host a grassroots event at the Capitol. So when I report on behalf of Forefront's activities, my salary and Alec's salary is not part of the reportable expenditures. It's just the money we spend on direct lobbying. And the reports at the state level are pretty simple, but they're frequent. So if you register, you really need to be prepared to comply with that biweekly reporting requirement and have processes in place internally at your organization to back that up. So if someone's on vacation or sick or forgets, that there's some due diligence there to make sure you don't miss the deadline. Because if you do, the fees rack up very quickly. I think it's like $100 a day or something. It's kind of crazy. And I know folks that have, been a few days late and then now they're sitting on $400 in fines. It's very frustrating, which we understand. And so it's important to be prepared for that as soon as you register. The fee for registering is $300 per entity. So like in our case, Forefront pays $300 to register as a lobbying entity. So that's tied to the organization. And then for each paid lobbyist that you have, you submit another $300 fee. So Alec and I are both registered, which means Forefront has to pay $900 a year, which we understand for smaller organizations can be a huge burden, especially because most grants and contracts don't permit the use of those funds for things like lobbying fees. And most donors don't want to support that, right? Like you don't fundraise at your gala, like who wants to, give us $300 check to cover our lobbying fee? It's not very appealing to donors. So the fee piece is something that we know is uniquely a big burden for our sector. So we're going to come back to that because we're working on getting that waived. So there's a couple screenshots here. I'll move quickly through this to just give you a feel for how the state system works. So when you have $0 in reportable expenditures, which for most nonprofits is the case most of the time, and that includes Forefront, like we don't have reportable expenditures hardly ever. You just submit a blank report every 2 weeks, basically. So this screen pops up and you press continue and then you press submit and you're done. So it takes about 30 seconds. But if you don't do that every 2 weeks on time, you will be fined. When you do have reportable expenditures, you can go to the next screen, Alec. I believe there's an example there. This is the kind of detail you have to report. So like if we take a legislator out to dinner or we were to host a reception and invite legislators in Springfield, like a meet and greet, we would have to report the expenditures for those kinds of things on this form, where it's pretty detailed. So I always encourage people like to just kind of avoid doing that whenever possible. There is a time and place where it's helpful and important and a priority when you're doing relationship building, but on a regular basis, it can start to feel like a burden. And so you want to be mindful of how often you make reportable expenditures. For grassroots event, so like if you have a lobby day at the Capitol, that's a different form. That's what's shown here. So if you have a bus of folks that you pay to travel, bus your stakeholders to Springfield, you would be reporting that transportation expense. Or if you have a catered meal at the Capitol that includes your stakeholders and legislators, you'd be reporting that. So there's a separate form for that. That's the grassroots lobbying statement. So any questions about the state reporting system? I was going to briefly touch on Chicago. Okay, I see a question in chat. We'll pick that up during Q&A, just like the prior one. So for the city of Chicago, the state's law that became effective last January specifically exempted cities over 500,000 people from the state's lobbying, registration, and reporting requirements. The only city that applies to in our state is Chicago. Nobody else has population in excess of that threshold. So it was intended to exempt Chicago and allow Chicago to continue to operate its own reporting and registration system for activity at the local level in Chicago. So it doesn't pertain to Chicago-based organizations that lobby the state. No matter where you live in the state, if you lobby the state, you still have to register at the state. But if you lobby the city council in Chicago, those local officials are exempted from the state law. So if you lobby local officials where I live, so I live in Bloomington Normal. If I lobby local officials in Bloomington Normal, I have to register at the state for lobbying at the local level. But if I live in Chicago and I lobby my local officials, I would have to register with the City of Chicago Board of Ethics in order to lobby the local officials in Chicago. So if you live in Chicago and you work with the city council or the city agencies, this is important for you to pay attention to. For everybody else, you can take a little nap. So the city has its own system. Alec, you can move along here. So they currently, though, and this is important, have a public statement and letter posted saying that they're not enforcing their system specifically for nonprofit organizations. So they're encouraging nonprofits to comply so you understand the system, but they're officially not enforcing that. So if you are engaged in active lobbying as a nonprofit with your city council, you do not currently have to register. but that's just a kind of statement they made that could be reversed really at any time. And so it's important to understand that the rules in place we're currently not being enforced to comply with, but that could change. And so it's still important to know the rules and be prepared to comply if and when that policy of non-enforcement is lifted. And I'll note, because we're entering a season where there's a possibility of a new administration and lots of new city council members coming into the body, there's a chance that that policy could shift, because with new leadership, we're not sure what approach they'll take. So as we reach that local election date, I'd encourage you to dig in on this and follow this issue. One of the good things about Chicago, though, is that they have a fee waiver in place for C3s, and their reporting requirements are less frequent than the states. So if you're a C3, when you register, there's a process by which you can certify your tax exempt status, and they'll waive the fee for you. And then their reporting dates are quarterly instead of biweekly. So there's some things that are more favorable to nonprofits at the local level in Chicago specifically. So this is a snapshot, though, of their report. So in contrast to the state and Chicago, the city, when you do report less frequently on a quarterly basis, those reports require more detail than the state does. So the state's only going to ask you to report the money you spent, while the city is going to ask you to document which agencies you lobbied and what the nature of those interactions were. So it's more narrative, and it's not just limited to money. It includes money, but it's not limited. They also want to know about your activities. So it takes a little bit longer at the city level, but it's quarterly, which helps. Go ahead, Alec. So this is a summary of the differences between the state and city. So this is particularly important for people that lobby both the city of Chicago and the state, which applies to Forefront. So we're registered in both places and complying with both of these sets of requirements. And so if that applies to you, it's just good to have your head around the differences between the two systems, so you can manage them effectively. And again, if you're going to register at the city and or the state, you want to make sure you have processes in place to manage the reporting requirements and not miss these deadlines so you don't rack up fees. Any questions about the city of Chicago? Since we had folks in the room. So this summarizes that if you only lobby the state, no matter where you live in the state, you register with the state. If you only lobby the city of Chicago, you register at the city, no matter where you live in the state. So if you live in outside Cook County, but you're lobbying the city council in Chicago, you have to register with the city. But if you lobby a local government that is not Chicago, you register at the state. And so it's confusing in our state, which is why we want to talk through these things, because it can take a minute to make sure you understand it all. Despite that confusion, though, the thing it's really important to stress is none of this is intended to convey that we think you all should not be engaged in our democracy. So it may take some time to get your head around these issues and these requirements, but we don't want that to stop folks. Your voices are so important, and you should have relationships with your elected officials. We encourage that. And we also want to encourage our sector kind of broadly not to consider lobbying as a dirty word, which kind of is the case sometimes, right? And I know a lot of boards in particular can be very kind of wary of their directors or staff registering as lobbyists, because there's some sense that there's not allowed to be any lobbying when you're a public charity. So that's why we led with that at the top, because that is actually not the case. You are allowed to do some lobbying, and lobbying serves a purpose in our democracy, and it's an important part of the process. And we encourage you to engage in this system. And if you're able to accommodate the fees and reporting requirements, and if you're not, to look for the ways to get around registering, but still to engage and rely on your uncompensated folks to do what would be considered lobbying, and make sure that you're using your voice and representing your stakeholders and your community needs with our elected officials. So I just want to stress that, because I don't want anyone to think we're here to talk you out of talking to your officials. It's really important that you continue to nurture those relationships and use your voice. Alec, you can go ahead. So we're working on some changes behind the scenes that would address some of the concerns that came up earlier today through both the rules process and pending legislation. So examples of that would be providing some guidance or exemptions around incidental contacts with local officials. So if you're falling into the camp of like, well, I periodically might speak to a county board member, or they might be on my board, but that's it. We don't really lobby the state, and this seems like overkill. We would like to help our elected officials understand that in those cases, lobbying, registration, and biweekly reporting year-round seems to be kind of an overreach. And then also some clarity around the role of compensation. So for example, if a person is compensated but participates in a grassroots communication or event, does that person need to register, which is a little unclear right now, because while there's an exemption for grassroots communication and events, there's that compensation test, and those two things seem to conflict. So we're seeking clarity on that. And at the city level in Chicago, we're working right now with city staff to make the fee waiver permanent and to apply a threshold for time and expenses similar to what the federal government does, so that, for example, you could certify that your lobbying activities and expenses don't exceed more than 20% of your time and expenses, and then you don't have to comply with the annual and quarterly reporting requirements. And in the rules process, we also want the state and the city to address the, and somebody asked about this, the growing number of virtual events, and help us understand when those would require registration and when they might be exempt. And then at the state level, also we'll be working on a bill. It's not filed yet, so I can't share a bill number with you or details yet, but we're trying to get a bill that would, at minimum, waive the fees for nonprofits in our state, so that the fee itself isn't a barrier to compliance with these rules. And that would go a long way to address some of the concerns, but it's not enough. So we're trying to tackle other things as well, like reducing the frequency of the reporting requirements at the state level. So I just wanted to share a couple next steps about how to get more involved. And so this is wrapping up the formal presentation, then we can go back to questions. So just bear with us for a couple more minutes. We wanted to give you a few examples of policy proposals we're working on at different levels of government, so that if you would like to get more involved with our policy work, you can do so in the context of the lobbying rules we just went over. So for example, at the federal level, first I'll make sure folks understand at the end of 2021, the federal government's universal charitable deduction expired. So in 2022, as we wrapped up the year, I was seeing some nonprofits do fundraising on the premise that if folks donated $300, they could get a federal deduction, which was not the case, unfortunately. So it made me realize, like, I don't think our stakeholders understand that this universal charitable deduction expired at the end of 2021. So I just wanted to flag that for folks, because if you're wrapping up your 2022 financials and realizing you had fewer donors, fewer donations, or fewer $300 donations than you did in 2021, this probably had something to do with it. And we would like to get those anecdotes from you so we can educate our congressional officials about the impact of the lapsed charitable deduction. So we're in an environment now where only itemizers, which are a very small minority of filers, only non-itemizers benefit from their charitable giving with the tax deduction, which isn't fair. All folks should get the same tax incentive for their generosity, not just the wealthiest among us that can itemize. So we're working on this at the federal level to ask Congress to reinstate a universal charitable deduction. Any questions on that? It's important. So at the state level, we have a couple bills that we'll be working on as forefront. One is kind of in tandem to the prior slide, which is intended to create a state level charitable tax credit. It's called the Endow Illinois Tax Credit. It's based on similar programs in other states, including Iowa. And this bill would provide a 25% state tax credit on gifts to permanent endowments at community foundations anywhere in the state. So if you give $1, you get a 25-cent tax credit, and so on. That total statewide program would be capped at 50 million. So that's intended to contain the cost. An open-ended tax credit to any 501c3 would be administratively impossible for the state, and the cost would be much higher and impossible to anticipate. So this is like a targeted proposal to drive resources into our sector in a way that's manageable for the state and mitigates the budget impact, but leverages potentially $2 billion in a decade. So just to make sense of that, at $50 million, a 25% tax credit means we're leveraging $200 million a year in charitable giving. And then over a decade, that turns into $2 billion in charitable giving that's been driven into our sector and incentivized that may not have been there before. In states that have programs like this, it's highly motivating. They have wait lists, and Iowa's endowments have more money and grants being made from those endowments through community foundations than on the Illinois side. So we have some data. I believe it's actually on the next slide if you want to go ahead, Alec, to show how compelling this is. So the just across the border in Iowa and Quad Cities Community Foundation, the endowment dollars per capita in their Iowa funds are 4 times as high as the endowments on the Illinois side. So it shows how this generates more giving and new dollars that then could be used to make grants to nonprofits in our communities. So that's why Forefront is supporting this. We see it as a way to incentivize new money in our sector that will help stabilize the sector over time. Any questions on that proposal? How would this impact Invest in Kids? No relationship whatsoever. No relationship. Forefront's not involved in the Invest in Kids. I do know there was an effort to extend their sunset or sunset it. We don't have skin in that game. So Invest in Kids is, yeah, it's a more generous tax credit. That is correct. I'm not sure we could get that in our proposal. Invest in Kids advocates were effective in getting that done. Most tax credits are 50 or 25%. Any other questions on that? Okay, so the next bill, the audit threshold bill, and this was one that Pam and Billy specifically asked us to cover because we knew there were some folks specifically in your geography working on this, and our sponsor, Representative West, is from your area. So last year we had this bill in the Senate. It was run by Senator Murphy, and then West picked it up because folks asked him to in the House, which is great because now we have companion bills in both chambers. It's bipartisan. We have a compromise with the AG. So we're very hopeful we can get this done this year, but we do need folks to engage with us. So when we issue that call to action, we just want to encourage you to participate by signing up for our alerts. And when we ask you to reach out, please engage on this bill. So what this does is raise the annual audit requirement threshold for nonprofits from requiring a full audit if you raise $300,000 in charitable contributions to $500,000. So it's intended to alleviate the full audit cost and burden on the smallest nonprofits in our state. And it doesn't eliminate financial reporting requirements for folks in that bracket. It just replaces the full audit with what's called a financial review, which is less costly, less time consuming, less burdensome for those smallest nonprofits. And what we found is that audits are essentially a regressive fee or tax, because no matter how much revenue you have, they cost about the same amount of money. So the smaller organizations are paying a much larger percentage of their revenue for their audit requirement compared to larger organizations that can handle that cost a lot more easily. So this is a way to support our smaller nonprofits, which are more likely to be led by persons of color, or serve persons of color. So there's also a racial equity component to this that's really important. And so I also want to note, for folks that don't know this, that Illinois' audit requirement is the most burdensome in the entire United States. So we're way out of sync with what other states are doing on this. There's about 20 states that don't have an audit requirement for nonprofits at all. And then those that do have a threshold that's 500, 750,000, $1 million, and even up to 2 million in charitable revenue before a full audit is required annually. And I also want to note, ironically, even our state agencies don't have to do an annual audit every year. A lot of them have a biannual requirement. So this is kind of a practical way to eliminate a burden for folks in any type of nonprofit business. So if this would impact you, I would encourage you to share your story with us and chime in when this bill comes up. But also, even if it doesn't impact you, you can support your smaller nonprofit counterparts by supporting the bill and asking folks in the legislature to do more to just make it easier for us to run our businesses. Any questions on this? Okay, there's some upcoming events we want to make you aware of. These are just examples of other ways you can get involved. We work closely with a lot of partners. So this graphic shown here lists some logos of folks we work with that are other statewide organizations that serve specific kind of niche parts of our nonprofit sector. And there's a virtual event coming up on February 10th that any of you would be welcome to attend. That event is focused on workforce issues. And Alec can share the registration link in chat because it's not visible on this graphic, but it's free, it's virtual, and usually it has a lot of folks, which is good because the strength in numbers thing is important. Legislators will be there, and you don't need to register just to attend if you're just attending and listening, so don't worry about that. So that's one opportunity to chime into that conversation with colleagues all over the state. Forefront itself will be running an event for advocacy rules around foundations later in February, and then we're traveling to DC with foundations in at the end of February and early March. So I don't know if anybody here today is from a private foundation, community foundation, any type of foundation. If so, raise your hand and we'll get you the FOTH information. We're hoping to take a big delegation. And then we're going to have a training probably in March. The date is somewhat tentative, but watch for that through our comms, where we do kind of a budget advocacy 101 with partners like the Responsible Budget Coalition and the League of Women Voters to talk to folks about how to understand the budget process and how to engage in what might be coming up this year, which is a really important part of our advocacy at the state level. And then finally, at least biannually moving forward, semi-annually, Forefront will be hosting a GATA readiness seminar. We did one last year, we're hoping to do 2 this year. This is another free event because GATA readiness is so important for anybody that plans to apply for a state or federal grant in Illinois, or that is managing one and struggling with its requirements. So if that piques your interest, just stay tuned for that. And you can check Forefront events on our website. And we'd be happy to come back to do anything on these topics with NICNE in the future too. So we're happy to partner. If you have an idea about what we can do to be helpful, you can always let us know as well. So on the bills we mentioned, the best way to stay in touch as those begin to move is to sign up for our Action Center, which is that QR code. So if you sign up, you'll get those calls to action, and you can engage freely without needing to register as a lobbyist because you're responding to our call to action. So that's a great way to stay in touch with Forefront's policy agenda at the federal and state level. And then we have lots of information on our website, including information about the topic today. So we have a whole page dedicated to the lobbying rules, and it has the email contacts for the Secretary of State, and all kinds of information, the definitions. And so you may want to bookmark that. That way you have that at your fingertips when you have questions that come up, and all those resources you need are there for you. And you can reach out to me or Alec anytime on this topic or anything else that we work on with our policy program. I think that's the end of the deck, Alec. Is there anything else in there? Oh, just our social media and email sign up. So that's the conclusion of the formal presentation. I do want to highlight these. Here's some more numbers. I mentioned Boulder Advocacy earlier. They're a very good technical assistance resource for questions related to lobbying. So I encourage you to also explore their website. They have some of their own trainings as well that you could lean on, and a hotline. So if you have an urgent issue, you can call the hotline and get some consultation right away. So with that, we can turn off the recording and conclude. I don't know, Pam, before we turn off, if you want to make any closing remarks, and then we can go into Q&A in a more casual fashion. Thank you so much.
No formal closing remarks, other than to thank both of you for being a wealth of information, being a resource for the nonprofits in our region as well. And to say we look forward to continuing to work with you at Forefront and sharing your resources with the organizations that we serve as we do capacity building with nonprofits in Northern Illinois. So thank you very much, both of you.
We're happy to be here. Thank you, Pam. Appreciate the opportunity.